Good morning, everyone. This is Professor Muhammad Farghal. In this lecture, I'll be talking about 4 problematic areas in translating between English and Arabic. Passivization, non-generic negation, the cognate accusative, and existential sentences. I'll be referring to 2 important terms often used by translation theorists: equivalence and correspondence. In the 50s, Vinay and Darbonet and Roman Jakobson talked about correspondence in the context of contrastive linguistics and translation. And probably the most important reference here is Vinay and Darbulnit's book, which has been translated into English, which talks about different translation procedures. Some of them are direct and some of them are indirect. They all work at the micro level, including shifts and transpositions and things like that, at different linguistic levels. Later on, Color, in 1979, I think, made an important distinction between equivalence and correspondence. Equivalence is the mark of a good translator. Correspondence is the mark of a good linguist. This simply means that the term correspondence is more relevant to contrastive linguistics for someone interested in the grammar of a pair of languages in order to explore correspondences from a structural point of view. This is very familiar in contrastive linguistics. So contrastive linguists are more interested in formal correspondences, whereas translators are more interested in translation equivalence rather than formal correspondences. Notice that at the macro level, theorists have been talking about 2 main strategies, macro strategies, involving formal versus functional correspondence. And this can be traced to many theorists, in fact. Recently, starting with Catford, Nida, House, Newmark, later on Venuti, Turi, all these people are more interested in macro strategies, which would result in either a source language oriented text or a target language oriented text. That's why we have the many dichotomies, which all lead to either a text that domesticates, in the main, of course, not exclusively, or foreignize, because these 2 strategies cannot be exclusive of each other. This simply means that we do not find a translation that's 100% domesticated or a translation that is 100% foreignized. At the micro level, correspondence would relate to gloss translation in particular, simply because linguists are interested in showing the similarities and differences between a pair of languages, and so far as grammar is concerned. Translators, by contrast, should be more interested in translation equivalence rather than in correspondences. In this lecture, as I have already pointed out, I'll be talking about 4 problematic areas which are relevant to the 2 terms, equivalence and correspondence, or translation equivalence versus linguistic correspondence. I'll start with passivization, passives. Formally, passivization is found in English and Arabic and has been studied from theoretical perspectives. The interest there is in contrastive linguistics to show how passivization works in English and Arabic from a theoretical kind of perspective. Early studies on passivization, which were related to translation, also followed suit and by advancing the claim that Arabic passives are fewer than English ones. And the claim that whenever you come across an English passive, render it as an Arabic active, simply because in Arabic the agent does not surface, or that is at least the claim found in the literature. But if one looks at passivization from a textual perspective, the picture will be completely different. It's not only that an English passive sentence should be translated into an active Arabic sentence, or agents only found in English, but they are not found in Arabic. These claims are lacking validity from a textual perspective. Textually, if we look at passivization between English and Arabic, we see that we have one option in English that corresponds to many options in Arabic. This simply means that in English passivization is structure-based. It's a matter of changing the word order and the logical relations between the arguments within the sentence. Whereas in Arabic, passivization is semantics-based rather than structure-based. What does that mean? This simply means that when we translate from English into Arabic, in English we'll find many passives. Only some of them go for passivization, and some go for activization, where there is an agent. But we have more options, more translation equivalents, which account for as many as probably these two procedures. We have nominalization, and we have passive participles, and incoativization. So in Arabic, we have 5 translation equivalents. In English, we only have one uniform kind of structure, the passive, which is based on word order. The implication for translating between English and Arabic is very clear here. When you are translating from Arabic into English, many non-passive sentences would be rendered into passive structures in English. By contrast, if you are translating from English into Arabic, many passive sentences would be translated into non-passive sentences from a formal perspective. What do we mean by nominalization? Nominalization is a very important translation procedure for rendering English passives, which involves the use of pleonastic or dummy passive verbs. Passive, why? Because they contract with dummy active verbs. So we have dummy passive verbs and dummy active verb. Notice that here we're talking about semantics rather than about form. So the dummy verb is active in form, but it is passive in meaning. So, for example, we have temma and we have qama. Temma is passive in meaning, and qama is active in meaning. قام بزيارة إلى المتحف. Now, this is nominalization, but this involves activization rather than passivization. تم بناء مدرسة جديدة في حينا. Note that this must be rendered into a passive structure in English. This is what we call nominalization. And nominalization is a very important translation procedure when encountering English passive structures. Passive participles are also an important procedure. Many passive structures may go for passive participles in Arabic. The ship was provided with air-to-air missiles. Was provided. This is a passive structure. In Arabic, كانت السفينة مزودة بصواريخ جو. مزودة here. This is a passive participle in Arabic, which is an important translation equivalent for English passives. It's possible to say زودت السفينة ب, but this is less natural than كانت السفينة مزودة. So the use of the past participle here is much more natural than the use of a formal passive. Accusatives, أفعال المطاوعة, are an important option in Arabic. The square was filled with demonstrators. Was filled. This is a passive structure. In Arabic, the best option is to use فعل مطاوعة. امتلأت الساحة بالمتظاهرين. These translation equivalents are there, and they should be added to the other two options, which are also there. Activization, all right, when we have, for example, when we have an agent and the agent is important. The Americas were discovered by Columbus. I think the best way to render this is اكتشف كولومبوس الأمريكيتين. اكتشف. So here we have a passive structure that is rendered into an active structure in Arabic where we have an agent. Also, sometimes it's possible to render the passive formally by using, all right, a passive structure is rendered into a passive structure in Arabic. The regulations have been violated many times. انتهكت التعليمات مرات عدة. Okay, انتهكت here is a passive structure in Arabic, and it is natural. So translators should be aware of these translation procedures, not only a matter of formal correspondence, a passive structure that should be rendered into either an active agentive structure or a passive agentless structure. The claim also that Arabic does not tolerate agentive passives is not valid either, simply because we find agent passives or agentive passives used in Arabic. All right, apart from min qibali, which is very common nowadays, and one should accept it when rendering passives, agentive passives, where the agent is the focus. But many people object to it. But I don't think this makes a lot of sense. But in addition to min qibali, we have agentive passives used naturally by using markers like B, على يد شرد ملايين الفلسطينيين على يد الصهاينة. شرد ملايين على يده. This is a marker of an agentive passive, and على يدي is used naturally in Arabic. So insofar as passivization is concerned, translators between English and Arabic should be aware of the fact that English passivization is structure-based, whereas Arabic passivization from a translation perspective is semantics-based rather than structure-based. You should also be aware of the fact that Arabic does tolerate agentive passives. It's true that agentive passive is not as common in Arabic as it is in English, but it's there. Nobody can deny it. So denying it is a false claim. So much of passivization. Let's move on to negation, another problematic area when translating between English and Arabic. In natural language, we have two types of negation. We have explicit negation, where we have explicit negation markers, and we have implicit negation, where the negation is done semantically rather than by a negation marker. Both types of negation are found in English and Arabic. In English, however, we have two types of explicit negation. We have explicit generic negation and explicit non-generic negation. Notice that explicit generic negation is found in Arabic, right? By using negative particles like lam, len, la, laysa. Okay, these are negative particles and they mark explicit generic negation. And in English, we have not, no, nothing. Also, these are explicit negative markers. The problem is that in English, we also have explicit non-generic negation, which is missing in Arabic. Explicit non-generic negation in English is performed by using the adverbial to, TOO, adverbs featuring ly, like hardly, barely, scarcely, and some determiners like few and little. These markers of explicit negation are non-generic in English. How do we render them into Arabic? This is problematic for most translators. You find professional translators not being able to cope with explicit non-generic negation in English. Two, it was too cold for John to swim this morning. We find some translators confusing to with an intensifier. كان الطقس باردا جدا لجون ليسبح جون. All I know is this is not natural Arabic. You cannot render such an utterance with using an intensifier like جدا. Simply because to here is a negative word, a negation marker. How does this work in Arabic? You will have to recover explicit generic negation. This is the most important option. لم يستطع جون السباحة بسبب برودة الطقس هذا الصباح. Okay, لم يستطع, not that here. I have recovered generic negation in Arabic. It's also possible to do this using implicit negation in Arabic. This can be done semantically rather than grammatically by a negative particle. منعت برودة الطقس جون من السباحة هذا الصباح. مثلا منع. This is also possible in English. Okay. The cold prevented John from swimming this morning. Okay, so this kind of negation should be rendered into either explicit generic negation or implicit negation in Arabic. Simply because it's missing in Arabic. We don't have this kind of negation in Arabic. So translators should be able to handle this, to be aware of what to do when they meet explicit non-generic negation in English. What about hardly? Hardly is problematic. If you look at professional translators, you find many of them using something that is non-standard, something that does not belong to standard Arabic. Bilkad. Bilkad is not standard Arabic. It's vernacular Arabic. They fail to recover explicit generic negation in Arabic. الفعل يكاد. I hardly did any studying yesterday. لم أكد أدرس أي شيء البارحة. لم أكد. Okay. I hardly know June. لا أكاد أعرف June. Note that translators are supposed to recover the correct form of the verb يكاد with a negative particle. Little and few can also signal negation. If you have a negative attitude towards something, then you might use little and few. And in Arabic, this is supposed to be captured using explicit generic negation. We only have little cheese in the fridge. لم يعد لدينا سوى القليل من الجبن في الثلاجة. لم يعد لدينا. No, لم يعد. Okay, this is explicit negation in Arabic. Note that this negation in English can be expressed by using little. I only have few students in my class. لا يوجد لدي سوى القليل من الطلبة في محاضرتي أو في مقرري. لا يوجد سوى. Okay, this is explicit negation in Arabic. In English, this can be performed by using few. So little and few here. can signal negation in English, and this should trigger the recovery of explicit negation in Arabic. You can see that how problematic this kind of negation is when translating from English into Arabic. And also when you are translating from Arabic into English, a competent translator should be able to recover some explicit non-generic negation in English. It's not there in Arabic, but any English text is supposed to feature. For example, it's impossible, for example, to have a book or a novel without using this kind of negation. So the translation of a novel into English is supposed to feature this, simply because this is part of English, despite the fact that it does not exist in Arabic formally. And in Arabic, we have explicit generic negation, but not explicit non-generic negation. At least the way it is found in English by these formal markers. One more problematic area when it comes to translating between English and Arabic is the cognate accusative, المفعول المطلق. And also we have cognate objects, not only cognate accusatives, objects that are derived from the matrix verb. Not that English does not favor this. We may have a couple of cases, for example, sing a song is a case which is still there. I think it's natural. He sang a nice song. Okay, this is all right. But what about he dreamed a horrible dream? Okay, one may accept it, but it's much more natural. Say he had a horrible dream rather than he dreamed. In Arabic, in both cases, say حلم حلما مرعبا غنى أغنية رائعة نزلت حلما رائعا. These are cognate objects. حاول محاولة يائسة. Okay. Can we render this formally? حاول محاولة. He attempted an attempt. And the answer is no. All right, we have to use what we call an affected object here. He made a desperate attempt to make an attempt. Notice that attempt here is used as an affected object. This is very common in English. And in Arabic, all right, in many cases we have cognate objects. But let's go to the cognate accusative, المفعول المطلق, which is a grammatical gap insofar as English is concerned. This simply means that we don't have this structure formally in English. In Arabic, we have this kind of form. The cognate accusative falls into 4 types. We have evaluative cognate accusatives. We have type cognate accusatives. We have number cognate accusatives, and we have pair cognate accusatives. Note that they differ in the function they perform in discourse. Evaluative cognate accusatives are meant only to emphasize the occurrence of some act. So if you want to emphasize an act as an act, then you can use an evaluative cognate accusative. طرده طردا. شرح الدرس شرحا. What am I doing here? I'm emphasizing the occurrence of some act, kicking someone out and explaining a lesson. These are the two acts I am emphasizing. Not that these can be problematic because many translators confuse them with type cognate accusatives. In fact, they are not type cognate accusatives. They don't indicate the type of the act, but rather they only emphasize the occurrence of the act. That's why in English one would use an auxiliary verb to emphasize the occurrence of some act. He did kick him out. He did explain the lesson. Or a lexical adverb which also emphasizes the occurrence of the act. For example, he explained the lesson indeed, or he kicked him out indeed. So both indeed and the verb to do here can perform the same kind of function by emphasizing the occurrence of the act. What about type cognate accusatives? They emphasize the occurrence of the act plus indicating its type. That's why it's called a type cognate accusative. شرح الدرس شرحا مفصلا. شرحا مفصلا. This indicates the type of the act. That's why it's called a type cognate accusative. Not that such type cognate accusatives are often rendered into adverbs in English. He explained the lesson in detail. In detail here, all right, this is a prepositional phrase that corresponds to or that functionally renders شرحا مفصلا. ضربه ضربا مبرحا. ضربا مبرحا. Again, this indicates the type of the act. He beat him up hard. Hard here is an adverb which renders ضربا مبرحا أو مبرحا. Number cognate accusatives indicate the number of the frequency of the act, okay? The frequency of the act, whether it was done once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, etc. That's why it's called number cognate accusatives. وقف وقفتين في طريقه إلى الحقل. Note that وقفتين here can be replaced with وقف مرتين في طريقه إلى الحقل. So the cognate accusative here, notice that وقف وقفتين. Okay, can we render this formally? And the answer is no. He stopped 2 stops on his way to the field. All right, this is not, doesn't work. We need what? We need something that textually renders the number cognate accusative. And here it is the use of the affected object in English, or verbalization, even without using the affected object, by just verbalizing. Verbalizing and using a frequency expression. So this can be written into, he made 2 stops on his way to the field, or he stopped 2 times or twice on his way to the field. So the affected object should not be lost sight of when rendering type cognate accusatives. And finally, here we have bare cognate accusatives. Bare cognate accusatives in Arabic suppress the verb, and we only have the cognate accusative. So the verb from which the cognate accusative is derived does not surface. صبرا على الشدائد. Here the underlying structure is اصبروا صبرا على الشدائد. اصبروا here can be dropped. And in English also we can drop by saying patience with hardships. Or we can use a verb, the verb to be patient with hardships. So the most important thing when it comes to handling the cognate accusative between English and Arabic is to be aware of the fact that correspondence, formal correspondence, does not work in the main, of course. So in most cases, one has to find textual equivalence, translation equivalence, rather than correspondences in terms of form, simply because they don't work. One might question this by saying, look at the Quran translation. You find translators using formal equivalence when it comes to cognate accusative, or many of them use formal equivalence. And the response to this is that this is not justifiable. Why do this? Does this affect the message being communicated? أخذه أخذ عزيز مقتدر, for example. أخذه أخذ. Do we have to say to seize with a seizure? أو نظر نظرة, to look with a look? Okay, some Quran translators do this, but I don't think this is the right way to do it. They do this out of what? Being so sensitive to the form of Quranic discourse. But do we have to worry about the form? At the end of the day, translation is an act of communication. So why bother about things like that? There's no good justification. كلم الله موسى تكليما. I guess they look at this as a type cognate accusative. I personally think it is evaluative rather than a type cognate accusative. So it's only a matter of emphasizing the occurrence of the act. If you look at Quran later, you find them translating this or rendering this into, sometimes formally, into type cognate accusatives. So the fact that the cognate accusative is a grammatical gap in English must be brought out for translators, and translators should be aware of this fact. So when they are translating from Arabic into English, many cognate accusatives should melt into other translation equivalents. And when you are translating from English into Arabic, some English utterances should go for the cognate accusative in the Arabic translation. If, of course, you want to offer a natural translation. Okay, finally, in this lecture, I'll look at existential sentences between English and Arabic. The existential sentence is a problematic area Why is that? Simply because the discourse of English uses more existential sentences than Arabic discourse. What about the others? What happens to them? Do they evaporate? Of course they don't evaporate. They are there within the translation. But if you are translating from English into Arabic, many existential sentences would melt into something else, into an unstated verb, a dynamic verb rather than a stated verb. The verb be in English, this is the uniform kind of verb in existential sentences, or the most used. For example, there was a deep silence in the hall. All right, this is an existential sentence in English. How do we render this into Arabic? All right, I think a competent translator would look for something that is not existential the way it is in English, or something that is dynamic. سادة صمت مطبق في القاعة. سادة, notice that سادة is a dynamic verb, whereas the verb be in English is a stated verb. There were lots of people at the clinic this morning. Again, the translator should be able to render this into something more dynamic. غصت العيادة بالمراجعين هذا الصباح. غصت. Okay, this renders an existential sentence. So many existential sentences in English should go into utterances that are more dynamic in Arabic. What about existential sentences that are rendered into existential sentences in Arabic? Notice that in Arabic we have many translation procedures. In English we have the verb be. All right, this is so much used in existential sentences. I think 99% of existential sentences in English use the verb be. In Arabic, we have formal markers of such sentence. We have ثمة and هناك. I think both, they are interchangeable. ثمة سبب رئيسي في عدم مجيئه. There is an important reason for his absence today. Okay. All right, ثمة or هناك. Also, we have a verbal option using the verb form يوجد. All right, يوجد سبب رئيسي لعدم مجيئه. لعدم مجيئه. يوجد. Okay, again, this is a possibility. Word order might be used in Arabic to render existential sentences by what? تقديم الخبر على المبتدأ, which might be used in, especially in argumentative discourse and in literary discourse, in order to what? To be more emotive. في الحديقة كلب. There is a dog in the garden. Okay. Okay. This is another translation procedure. So in addition to using dynamic verbs, as predicates in existential sentences. We have formal markers, تمت and هناك. We have the verb form يوجد, and we also have word order. Okay, starting with the comment rather than the topic. And this is a must if we have, in Arabic at least, when we have an indefinite topic. So when translating between English and Arabic, many existential sentences in English should be rendered into dynamic, non-stative sentences in Arabic, in addition to the availability of three main translation procedures: formal markers تمت and هناك, the verbal form يوجد, and word order. Okay, so in this lecture, I have shown how grammar can be very relevant to the translation process. When it comes to grammar, it's not a matter of one-to-one correspondence. It's usually a matter of one-to-many correspondence or many-to-one correspondence. And here we have to distinguish between equivalence and correspondence. Equivalence is relevant to translating. Correspondence is relevant to contrastive linguistics. In translation, we are after textual equivalence, translation equivalence, rather than formal correspondences. So, in this lecture, we have discussed 4 problematic areas, which are very relevant to translating between English and Arabic. If a translation is to sound natural at the micro level, these 4 problematic areas should be taken care of. Passivization, explicit non-generic negation in English, the cognate accusative in Arabic, and existential sentences between English and Arabic. Thank you very much and have a good day. Goodbye.